right, we're off to our next topic, which is terrorism. Before we can get into the terrorism topic, I just want to make sure that we understand that there are different definitions for terrorism. This happens to be the FBI, the United Nations has a definition, the CIA. I guess it depends on who you ask and what organization you're listening to. But there's a difference between international and domestic terrorism. Domestic inside, international is more on a global scale. I also want to point out that from 1962 to 72, 159 planes in the United States were skyjacked, for the most part, all having to do something with Cuba. So, one of the earlier hijackings was the one with D.B. Cooper, and this individual doesn't have a political motive. This guy boards a plane, demands a ransom, and pretty much jumps out with the money with his parachute, and they never hear from this individual again. The Holder and Kirkhow, this individual had served in the Vietnam War, and he was dishonorably discharged as a result of smoking marijuana in the Vietnam War. Led to his discharge, which pretty much put him on a pretty bad path when he arrived back to the United States. Him and his girlfriend boarded a flight and skyjacked it. Eventually, they wound up in France, and these individuals, she has yet to be found. This individual did turn himself in at some particular point. This is an interesting one, the Thai Bin hijacking. Thai Bin is interesting because he's upset about the Vietnam War, but this individual was thrown out of the plane. At that point, the pilots and the crew were kind of annoyed with the amount of hijackings and ready for it. At that point, you have over 100 hijackings that take place. People are a little more responsive as opposed to it being like the first or second time. Now you have another hijacking. Notice the reason, police brutality. Here you have yet another one. This is for save my sons and your sons too. I am trying to save America, to save the whole world because we're all crazy. This individual's upset about the United States, some of the injustice that he had faced. What about the Klan? Do they represent a terrorist organization? Well, if your goal is to intimidate a population or influence the government or to affect the conduct of the government, well, let's just take segregation. If you want to keep segregation, well, that is about you trying to change the government's position. And if you're trying to intimidate, well, how would you do that if you're the Klan? Well, you just throw a bomb in the 16th Street Baptist Church, which kills these 4 girls. Weathered Underground, we've talked about them already. The 1968 presentation, The Tale of Two Sixties. The Weathered Underground started as the SDF's organization. Its hardcore members break away, and they create an organization called the Weathered Underground. Their 2 main objectives: end the Vietnam War and end police brutality. They outlined their ideas in Prairie Fire, right there. In the 1970s, you also have a couple of global example terrorist issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about the PIRA, which is a group that's advocating for the independence of Northern Ireland. In this particular incident, Bloody Friday, they set off a series of bombs in about 90 minutes. Here's the location. Let's take a look at terrorism in the name of Arab independence. Can't look at Arab frustration without looking at the creation of Israel. To sum up this piece of history here, at the end of World War II, the United Nations creates the State of Israel. Surrounding Arab states attack Israel over land. Eventually, Israel has to fight the war for independence. They fight the Six-Day War. They fight a series of wars, and before you know it, Israel starts to increase in size. By the time you get to the 1970s, there starts to emerge a series of terrorist organizations or political organizations, depending on which side you want to side with. And you start to see a wave of terrorist attacks, primarily directed towards Israel with regard to Palestine. Groups like Black September and the Olympics, 1972 Munich Olympics, where the terrorist organization Black September kidnapped the Israeli Olympic team and executed them. Also, events like the Dawson Field hijacking, where planes were hijacked, and often by the time you get into the 70s, global domestic, especially on issues involving Israel and any sort of Arab cause or the Palestinian cause. Sometimes these planes were hijacked and there weren't any casualties. It's almost like they were nice terrorists.
Tre flygplan står uppställda på Dawson-Field i Jordanien. Och alla passagerare håller.
Our demands and conditions are very clear, and we will not go back on them no matter what happens. These conditions are the release of Comrade Layla Khalid and the martyr's body, and their arrival to a safe place in exchange for the British hostages.
So the demands, it almost seems like terrorists are in custody. So we're going to conduct terrorist attacks until you release those people in custody. I just don't see how those issues get resolved. Let's not forget that in 1979 in Iran, there was the the hostage crisis, where the U.S. embassy was seized and the U.S. Citizens were taken hostage. This was possibly supported by Ayatollah Khomeini, and this is where you start to see in 1979 the Islamic revitalization movement, which is separate from what the Arab cause is about. This is where you start to see religion playing a role. Up to this point, terrorism was not conducted by Muslims believing in Al-Qaeda's interpretation of Islam. How did that brand of terrorism emerge? Well, we'd have to first look at this guy, Abdullah Azzam, who was bin Laden's mentor. He wrote this piece in response to the Soviet-Afghan War, the defense of Muslim lands. Pretty much what he argued was that since the Soviets have invaded Afghanistan, every Muslim around the world has an obligation to fight in Afghanistan. Bin Laden would be one of the many individuals that would eventually find themselves in Afghanistan. They also followed some of the ideas of Saeed Qutb. This guy was from Egypt, and he was somebody who was a crucial member of the Muslim Brotherhood, maybe a political organization, maybe a terrorist organization, depending on who you ask. This individual wrote this piece called Milestones, where he wanted to kind of purify his religion and remove some of these components from society. That way Muslims could practice their religion in its purest form. Eventually, his ideas influenced people like Abdullah Azzam, but Azzam's writing specifically about Afghanistan. This guy's writing about Muslims pretty much in general. All of these ideas would eventually influence people like Osama bin Laden. Here you see a chart of some of the Muslim Brotherhood and some of the people that are affiliated with it or people that have fought in the Soviet-Afghan War. Here we see Saeed Qutb. Here we see Abdullah Azzam. Here we see other individuals that find themselves in Afghanistan in the Soviet-Afghan War. And these individuals would eventually create the organization of Al-Qaeda. So I just kind of tracked them. Here you see the people that created the Muslim Brotherhood. This guy, Saeed Qutb, writes his piece Milestones. And here you start to see some of his followers and how they listen to some of his ideas, find themselves in Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War, where Abdullah Azzam writes his piece, The Defense of Muslim Lands. And then you see them influence everybody, all the way up to the 9/11 hijackers over here. So their ideology is very different from anybody advocating for the Palestinian cause. Even though these individuals would advocate for the Palestinians, they seem to be more concerned with the purification of their religion. Individuals like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, this is the guy who planned the 9/11 attacks. This right here is the guy who is the current leader of Al-Qaeda. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These are the 5 core key members that will eventually form Al-Qaeda in the early 90s. And then bin Laden would write his piece in 1998. What's your terrorism summary? Pause it, because here's mine. The term has many different definitions, and the 1970s is a golden age for terrorism. Think about the groups PIRA. Think about all of the planes being hijacked. Think about the weathered underground. None of those groups have anything connected to Islam. That's something that would emerge in 1979 after the revolution in Iran and the Soviet-Afghan War.